purpose of this video is to ensure that you have enough tools to be able to know how to analyze poetry and what the expectations for a 4U student going into university would need to be able to do. So there's a number of things that I want to go through. The first is we're going to be in content in Unit 2, Activity 3. So as we scroll down, we have some poems that we're going to be looking at. And the information here is pointing us in the direction that we need to make sure that we know how to analyze poetry. Poetry is a little bit different than analyzing a short story because it's a lot shorter. And there are some poetic devices that are utilized specifically to give the poem more meaning than the reader would necessarily have with a short story. So when we're going through here, one thing that it provides is this chart, and this is really good. These are very common poetic devices that you need to know about how poets write their poetry. So we have things like stanza, which are groups of lines together. Each line, a rhyme scheme would indicate the rhyming pattern that it has within it. Sometimes in longer poems, there can be verses and getting back to even a chorus or a repetition of a specific group of lines. And last but not least, we have the structure of free verse, where there is no rhyming scheme, there are no stanzas, there's no particular way in which this poem was written. Each of these has a purpose, that it allows the reader to read it a certain way, but also it allows it to be read a certain way. And the pace in which you read it is really important, where you pause, where you put emphasis. All of these things can be given by these particular parts. And it can also indicate the type of poem it is. We won't necessarily need to get into that, but each type of poem can actually incite different ways of reading it, or that its intended purpose. It could be about specifically love, it could be about nature, it could be a number of different things, and the type of poem indicates that. Next in poetry is the idea of creating images and conveying meaning. So imagery, mood, tone, and even synesthesia are really important to identify within the poem. Imagery is meant to bring the reader in because these are things that they can see, hear, touch themselves. So it evokes a certain idea within the reader's mind. And the tone and mood are often incited by certain words, or even the setting can give the tone or mood that is meant for this particular poem. If it's evoking imagery about a bright sunny day, typically it's not going to be a sad poem. But many of the poems that have deep meaning, that there's a sadness there or something that's happening that's evoking a tone or mood that indicates that this isn't going to be a happy, sunny topic. These are some of the poetic devices that are really important to know, understand, and be able to identify within a poem. And so it is really important that you review these, and just going through all of these right now, how they convey meaning, but also how sounds of words, so how words are put together versus how they actually sound when they're read, and how they cause you to speed up, to slow down, whatever it is that it wants you to focus on. So these are very important poetic devices that are important. So let me get into that. Poetic devices. So right down below here is actually a PDF guide, and it's quite a few pages long, but it outlines in alphabetical order all the different devices, what their meaning is, and even gives an example. So this can be a great resource to go through. I would highly recommend looking through and seeing what ones you do know, and then reviewing the ones that you don't know, so that when you're asked to identify those within a poem, that you are in fact able to do that. Okay, so Some other resources that you have here. So just going back to, there is a poem right down here, and you're going to be looking at it through a gendered lens. We talked about lenses in Unit 2, Activity 1, and throughout Unit 2, Activity 2 as well. And you've been practicing using those. So scrolling through, we are looking at how to analyze a poem. And that's what we're gearing up for in this particular one. We're going to be looking at it through particular lenses, but we're also going to be making sure that we know how to analyze poetry. So how do we take these devices, make sure we know them, and then get into how to analyze poetry? So what I have done is I've actually created a guide for how to analyze poetry. And so you can use this if you've never done poetry analysis. And really what we want to get to is to be able to do this. This is a poem that I use in my 4U class, especially my AP classes, as this appeared one time on an AP test. And so now it's widely used and recognized as a really good poem. That you want to annotate, and you want to be able to go through and identify the meaning of a poem and be able to identify certain things like hyperbole, personification, there's symbols in there, and how we can annotate and make meaning of that. So where do we start? So I'm going to show you just by using this poem and using this guide that I'm going to provide in the daily agenda, that you can actually go through this guide. It's a step-by-step guide to be able to, I'm going to see if I can do a split screen here. So I'm going to have the poetry analysis guide over at the side here. I'm going to, I'll bring up this one, and sorry about that. And I've been doing some editing. There we go. So now I've got a split screen, so I've got the two of them. So how do I, after I've reviewed all the poetic devices that I need to be able to identify, what do? I've got this poem in front of me. The very first thing that I want you to do is think about the title. And I do word association in my class. So I would get them to think about breaking it down as black, walnut, tree. And when we do that, often black incites a color of strength, of darkness. There's a number of words associated with that. And then as we move towards walnut, walnuts are actually one of the hardest nuts to crack. So they're very tough and hardy. And last but not least, with tree, we often go through the idea of like a tree can represent strength. When we look at a tree, we often think family tree. We think of all the different parts, the leaves, the trunk, the roots, and how the roots are actually usually bigger than the tree up top itself. And then we play with sort of all of those things. And then we go into, what do we know about black walnut trees? What do they look like? What are they used for, etc. So by looking at the title, we can get an idea of what this story might be about. I think it's about something strong. I think it's about something that represents family. I think it's about connections. It's about all of these components. And so I have a concept, and it may not end up being that. When you play sort of the word game, when it comes to titles, the poem may not actually be about that. Next is reading poetry. So the next thing that I want you to think about is looking at how to read it, paying attention to punctuation. So even though this is a very short part here, it's not the end of the sentence. If we were to look for a period to indicate the sentence, it would be here. So we wouldn't read this, my mother and I debate, we could sell the black walnut tree to the lumberman and pay off the mortgage. We're not pausing at the end of every line. What we do have is some punctuation that would indicate a pause here, here, and here. So rather, we want to look at clumps of what's actually a statement so that I can try and get an idea as to how to read this. So it should be read, my mother and I debate, We could sell the black walnut tree to the lumberman and pay off the mortgage, period. Right? And we want to do the same here. Likely some storm anyway will churn down its dark boughs, smashing the house. We talk slowly, two women trying in a difficult time to be wise. Other than boughs getting to me. So I'm looking for an overall meaning. What I want to do is I want to read through this poem a couple of times, and I want to pay attention to punctuation so that I know how it would be read. What I often suggest is paying attention to punctuation while you're reading it the first time. And at the very end of the poem, I've converted this into a Google Doc so that I can highlight or I can make notes. I can do a number of things. And at the bottom of this, what I would do typically is I would want to make sure that I have an understanding of what this poem is about. What do I think it means? And then jot it down there. Then I'm going to read it a couple of times, just to see if I change the meaning of it or if I understand. Okay. The other things that I'm going to be doing as I go through the second and third time is identifying any words I don't understand. I'm going to be looking for a theme or a key idea. I'm going to be looking to see if the idea that I had in the first place is correct. I'm even going to summarize. Sometimes I do this and then I make a comment so that I can say what that main idea is all about. Okay, you can highlight, you can make comments, you can do all of those things. That's why I like using a Google Doc in which to annotate, especially when I'm working online. I'm a paper person, so this just makes a little bit more sense. Then the second thing we want to do after we've kind of got the gist of what this poem might be about is that we want to start breaking down some of these concepts, right? So we went through these before. Is there a rhyme scheme? And when I look, debate, usually it's like this line, every other line rhymes. Debate, tree, debate, sell, tree, lumberman, mortgage, anyway, bows. Talk, trying, wise, drains, nope. Wise replies. We kind of sometimes have some rhymes in there, but it's not a rhyme scheme. It's not consistent. And so maybe wise and replies, maybe that was chosen so that we focus on those specific words or slow down, but it's typically unrhymed, and describe any potential rhymes that might be in there and what they might mean. Meter means, is it a particular rhythm in which you read? And I would say yes, we're kind of reading in slow statements that is consistent throughout the poem. And then what we want to do is what this author did, or not this author, but this student did up here, which is going through and identifying, underlining, circling, highlighting any of the devices that we looked at. And so some of them are listed down here. So all of these here are resources that you can use to sort of like, I'm going to go through and see if I can find an allusion, which is a reference, or I'm going to find a metaphor, which this tree, hint, hint, is a metaphor just in this particular poem. There's similes that using like or as. Why are those included? What are they representing? So looking for all of those, and then some of the sound devices. Quick as the trowel. There's a few ones in there that might be onomatopoeia, which is sound words. And why would they be in there? What is the author trying to get you to slow down and focus on in terms of imagery? And if you were to look up the poem, what do you want to know about the poet, why they wrote this poem, etc. So by going through each of these steps and then looking at the poem, so you go through the title, read through a couple of times, make sure you know how to read it, identifying any words you don't understand so that you can make sure you make meaning of it, identifying the tone or mood and how do you know that, what words are giving you that, and then go through and look for examples of these and annotate either on your document or a piece of paper, whatever works best for you. So these are the purposes in which we are looking at poems. And that'll be really important. When you go through for the assignment, you're going to actually see this planning worksheet. I've put it in as a Google Doc so that you can either in Word or in here, you can enter in the information so that you can choose between the two poems. You're going to choose one of those two poems after going through all of these questions. You could possibly annotate using a Google Doc and then input the information. You're going to choose one of these from the content, and you're going to analyze it, and you're going to submit both that worksheet and your analysis.